thank you all for attending this. Very nice conversation on a very nice, now somewhat winter evening. आज हम यहाँ सब इकट्ठे हुए हैं. We've all gathered here to listen to the new launch of the BSE Index Infrastructure Fund from the Aditya Birla Asset Management Company. हम सब जानते हैं कि एक डेवलपिंग नेशन के लिए इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर कितना जरूरी है. इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के बिना हम कोई भी काम नहीं कर पाएंगे. ना हम यहाँ से वहां खुद जा पाएंगे, ना कोई भी चीज हमारे पास आ पाएगी. सो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इज रिक्वायर्ड फॉर रेलवे, फॉर रोडवेज, फॉर शिपिंग, फॉर एवरीथिंग. Infrastructure is the backbone of a developing economy. It is extremely critical that the infrastructure spends in our country are able to pick up very, very quickly so that we are able to attain the status of a developed nation as we are all dreaming of today. So once again, we have a good number of people on the call. I would like to thank everybody for attending, and I hand over to our Head of Passive Product, Mr. Deepak Yadav. He will take you through the details of the infrastructure NFO. I have requested Deepak, मैंने दीपक को specifically request किया है कि जो भी important points हैं वो दोनों हिंदी और अंग्रेजी दोनों में repeat करेंगे so that we don't have a challenge on the language. This is a webinar. I will not be able to unmute anybody. तो hand raise करने की बजाय मेरा रिक्वेस्ट है, प्लीज आपके जो भी सवाल हो वो Q&A बॉक्स में डालें. हम सारे सवालों का जवाब कॉल के बाद देंगे, आपके प्रेजेंटेशन के बाद देंगे. थैंक यू सो मच एंड ओवर टू यू दीपक.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening and namaskar to everyone who joined in. As ma'am was saying, जैसा आपको सामने स्क्रीन पे भी दिख रहा होगा, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर एक ऐसी थीम है जो भी इस देश में हो रहा है उसको एंड से एंड बांधने के लिए बहुत जरूरी है. एंड दैट इज द कोर थीम दैट वी आर काइंड ऑफ डिस्कसिंग. अगर हम इस थीम की बात करते हैं तो ये काफी प्रिविलेंट और एग्जिस्टिंग थीम है आज के दिन म्यूचुअल फंड इंडस्ट्री में. पैसिव फंड साइड में या इंडेक्स फंड साइड में ज्यादा ऑफरिंग नहीं है. इनफैक्ट द बीएससी इंडिया इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इंडेक्स के लिए ये पहला फंड है जो ये इस इंडेक्स को केटर कर रहा है. And we'll get into the details for why this index as we get started. But उससे पहले let me quickly get you started with why infrastructure and why it is a need of the hour. अगर हम headline numbers की बात करते हैं तो we are now the largest in terms of population with 1.4 billion people. हमारी per capita income $2500 की हो गई है, which is 2500 and is expected to continue to rise here onwards. Naturally, with higher per capita income, the disposable income is also rising. There is an evolving kind of pattern when you look at urban and rural consumption dynamics. When you look at simple things like UPI transactions, they are up by more than 40% in volume year on year and by more than 30% in value. And bulk of that is today, for example, coming from tier 2 cities. So largest number of people, growing incomes, openness to transacting, more disposable income being spent. Naturally, when you look at the demand for freight movement in India, it is growing up exponentially. When you look at the other elements which are at play, things like कि जो हमारा manufacturing का growth plan है, when you look at how IMF and the global world looks at India today to kind of, take up manufacturing in a bigger way, to kind of give the world an option to non-Chinese manufacturing also, because aaj ke din the world is, almost all of the world has the risk factor of relying solely on China. So whether it is for domestic consumption or export, whether it is from, again, domestic policy on this or global requirement from all of this, again, there's a healthy need for making more. And to make more, again, you need to move both raw materials and produce goods around. So infra becomes a backbone. The total PLI, which is production link incentives for exports, is now at about 3.2 lakh crore, just to leave you with a number. कि कितना important है कि India makes this transition and we kind of go into the next few years with a healthy kind of a backdrop as an economy. when we look at the enablers for this theme, क्या है कि इंफ्रा आज के दिन भी रेलेवेंट है, क्यों रेलेवेंट है और क्यों आगे भी रेलेवेंट रहेगा. सो अगर हम केपेक्स की बात करते हैं, सो द लार्जेस्ट एवर केपेक्स ऑफ 11.11 लाख crores, which is about 5.3% of real GDP. सो दो जीडीपी के नंबर्स होते हैं, रियल या नॉमिनल. तो 5.3 ऑफ आप ले लीजिए रियल, या 3.4 ऑफ नॉमिनल. So whichever way you look at it, it's infra is one of the only themes which is spoken in reference to GDP, not just budget. So the largest ever budget headline of 11.11. पिछले साल यही नंबर 10 लाख का था, so more than 11% growth, and effectively kind of growing here onwards as well. जब हम ये इंफ्रा की स्पेंडिंग की बात करते हैं, सो देयर इज आल्सो अ जीडीपी मल्टीप्लायर इफेक्ट. फॉर एवरी रुपी दैट द गवर्नमेंट स्पेंड्स एज केपेक्स, द ओवरऑल जीडीपी ग्रोथ इज अबाउट 3x पर स्टार्ट्स फ्रॉम आरबीआई, की ऑलमोस्ट 3 गुना जीडीपी प्रोडक्शन बनती है फॉर एवरी रुपी दैट काइंड ऑफ गेट्स स्पेंट ऑन दिस थीम. When you talk about the manufacturing push that I was mentioning, more than 3 lakh crores in PLI has been approved across some of the key manufacturing sectors. These are classically आपका auto हो गया, pharma, white goods, textiles, some of the places where India to a degree has already been doing well. When you look at public-private partnership, historically there was a lot of red tape in terms of what are the constraints and clauses for getting payments and the delivery timelines. So flexibility has been introduced in the model concession agreement, which is effectively the main paper on the back of which, let's say, this partnership goes on, to ensure that private players who are participating in the infrastructure growth of India get remunerated and don't get punitively, let's say, hit due to minor delays. जब हम एक मेजर ट्रांसफॉर्मेशनल चेंज की बात करते हैं, तो सबसे मेजर ट्रांसफॉर्मेशनल चेंज जो इंडिया में आज के दिन वो हो रहा है, वो है आपका ग्रीन एनर्जी ट्रांजिशन. So our power sector is evolving dramatically. आज के टाइम में, in effectively in this year, we are generating about 14 to 15%, 15% ले लीजिए, of our percentage of our total power in the country through your non-fossil fuel based, या in simpler terms again renewable, क्या उसको tag दे सकते हैं, through renewable sources to a degree. That has to grow from this roughly 15% number now with a target of 50%, 50% by 2030. So there's a massive energy transformation which is happening. In the COP26 with Modi ji attended last year in Glasgow, he committed to this transformation to kind of reduce the carbon footprint of India as a country. And this transformation, along with the growing demand of power, will kind of create this duopoly कि और पावर चाहिए, जो ठीक है चाहिए तो कैपेसिटी किधर ऐड करेंगे, नॉन रिन्यूएबल में. Who needs more power? Both we as individuals, as salaries are going up, as the disposable income that we spoke of is going up, as to a degree overall, let's say, urbanization is increasing. Individuals need more power, and the make in India drive or the production drive in India, which is, let's say, the corporate side, also needs more power. So there is need for more power. There's a growing power deficit month on month for the last 2 years, adjusted for seasonality. And the push towards green energy, towards solar, again through incentives, is naturally there. जब हम बात करते हैं एफडीआई की, so the power sector has received the largest focus on FDIs. The overall theme जब हम बात करते हैं, so over in the last 4 years, $380 billion की एफडीआई मिली है इंडिया में इस सेक्टर में. So overall, the push for foreign direct investments with some parts of the green energy transformation enabling as much as 100% FDIs, there's a push on kind of attracting investments in India. जब हम पॉलिसी सपोर्ट की बात करते हैं कि हाउ इज द पॉलिसी फ्रेमवर्क, व्हाट आर द मेन प्रोजेक्ट्स, सो देयर आर लॉट्स ऑफ पॉलिसीज एंड प्रोजेक्ट्स लाइंड अप, एंड वील गेट इनटू देम इन सम मोर डिटेल. बट सम ऑफ द की वंस फॉर यू गाइस टू रिमेंबर इज आपका पीएम गति शक्ति, national infrastructure pipeline, national logistic policy, and a few others which we'll speak of. जब हम पिछले 10 सालों की बात करते हैं, which is the decade that has just gone by, चीजें कैसे बदली हैं, how have things transitioned? So some of the key stats which I'd like mentioning are कि track laying almost 275% से rise हो गई है. So net like 375% जब तकरीबन 4 किलोमीटर होती थी, वी आर क्लोजिंग इन ऑन 15 किलोमीटर। जब आप रोड्स की बात करते हैं तो रोडवेज की जो डेली कंस्ट्रक्शन थी तकरीबन 11-12 किलोमीटर होती थी, अब आप 33 किलोमीटर की बात कर रहे हैं, सो ऑलमोस्ट अ 3x जंप। When you talk at the total number of airports in the last 10 years, we've kind of more than doubled. अगर आप रिन्यूएबल की बात करते हैं तो अब से 10 साल पहले, मैंने आपको कुछ देर पहले बताया था दैट अबाउट 15% ऑफ आवर एनर्जी is 15 is coming from renewables right now, and the target is to bring it to 50 down the road by 2030. But less than 4% used to come from renewable when Modi government first came into power. So almost a 3x, 4x jump in this period, and a continued jump to almost growing this number again by more than 3x in the next 6 years. So across the board, whether you look at road, rail, power, there's a transformation journey which has happened and which will continue to happen here on. So it is a, as India is, rising up that overall GDP ladder, as we are becoming the more prosperous country, infrastructure is a key backbone that is enabling it. We have made very good progress, but the progress ahead of us is even further. तो जैसे हम पॉलिसी और प्रोजेक्ट्स की बात कर रहे थे, तो सम ऑफ द की पॉलिसीज एंड प्रोजेक्ट्स विच आर एनेबलर्स विल बी आपका पीएम गति शक्ति। कुछ जो इसमें अलग हो रहा है वो ये है कि पीएम गति शक्ति यूजेस अ लॉट ऑफ टेक्नोलॉजी, सो इट यूजेस जियो स्पेशल एनालिटिक्स। इफेक्टिवली आप समझ लीजिए आपके गूगल मैप्स का ही एक भाई का वर्जन है वो, इफेक्टिवली विच फोकसेस ऑन सिमिलर टेक्नोलॉजी फॉर डिसाइडिंग ऑप्टिमल रूट्स की रोड कहाँ से बिल्ड करना चाहिए, उसमें क्या चैलेंजेस आएंगे, उसमें क्या ग्रेडेशन आएगी, कितना रोड एक्सटेंशन की वजह से टाइम एक्सटेंड हो सकता है। सो इट यूजेस ऑल ऑफ दैट फॉर डिसाइडिंग वेयर टू बिल्ड द रोड्स फ्रॉम. So it enables optimal route planning and kind of enables streamlining of existing bottlenecks. अगर आप दूसरे की पॉलिसी की बात करते हैं विच इज अगेन अ मेजर एनेबलर, इट इज नेशनल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पाइपलाइन। तो ये एक लाइव डैशबोर्ड है जो ट्रैक करता है एनी इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट्स विच आर मोर देन 1 बिलियन रुपीज। Now, which is effectively any large projects, any meaningfully large projects. Why does this also is to enable monetization. कल के दिन कोई प्राइवेट प्लेयर आके गवर्नमेंट को बोलता है कि सर मैं ये पूरा प्रोजेक्ट की कॉस्ट आपसे ले लेता हूँ, बट आप मुझे टोल ऑपरेट एंड ट्रांसफर का लाइसेंस दे दो ताकि आई कैन ऑपरेट द टोल फॉर द नेक्स्ट 10, 20, 30 years, etc. Then the government can showcase, okay, this is the progress so far, this is how much capex is left, and this is by when you can expect to monetize it. So an infrastructure pipeline or live dashboard enables that transparency and enables private participation in terms of monetization, ताकि गवर्नमेंट का पैसा फ्री हो और किसी और प्रोजेक्ट की तरफ जा सके. The third one to kind of remember, and this is one of the more interesting ones, is national logistics policy. So अगर आप देखते हैं इंडिया में आज के दिन भी हम लोग प्रिडोमिनेटली रोडवेज के ऊपर डिपेंडेंट है फॉर मूविंग आवर गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज अराउंड. When you look at the global mix of modes, rail or typically आपका train has a higher mix. In India, freight by train is less than 35% of our overall freight usage. And effectively, to bring the cost of freight down, we need to rely more on the railway side and let's say the sea route or the coastal route side of things because they are cheaper. Roadways is relatively the most expensive of the three. So the government is planning building of multimodal logistical parks. ये कुछ ऐसे एरियाज आइडेंटिफाई करे जाएंगे जहां पे आपका रोडवेज, रेलवेज एंड सी और इनलैंड वाटरवेज कैन इंटरैक्ट विद ईच अदर एंड यू कैन मूव let's say goods from one mode of transportation into another. And by having hubs like this with warehousing facility, the overall flexibility of moving between modes will be enabled, जो आज के दिन काफी कम है. So to kind of make this into reality is where आपके लास्ट दो प्रोजेक्ट आते हैं, भारतमाला और सागरमाला. भारत, सो इंडिया में रफली इफ यू सॉ इन द प्रीवियस स्लाइड अबाउट आपका 150,000 किलोमीटर ऑफ रोड्स आज के दिन एग्जिस्ट करते हैं. 25,000 किलोमीटर का एक्सटेंशन करने का प्लान है अंडर भारतमाला, विच इज द सिंगुलर मोस्ट लार्जेस्ट रोडवेज एक्सटेंशन प्रोजेक्ट विच इज ऑन गोइंग. एंड सिमिलरली सागरमाला के ऊपर भी अबाउट 5.8 ट्रिलियन का एक्सपेंस एक्सपेक्टेड है इन द नेक्स्ट 11 odd years फॉर एनहांसिंग पोर्ट कनेक्टिविटी, पोर्ट कैपेसिटी, पोर्ट मॉडर्नाइजेशन as well as new port development. So these are some of your key policy initiatives and project initiatives which will play out over the next decade to kind of take India's infrastructure to the next level. When we look at this theme कि क्या नया है, क्यों है, कब कब से कैसे करना है, so this is the first index fund in fact which is benchmarking itself to the BSE India Infrastructure Index. So mostly अभी तक एक्टिव फंड्स हैं और पैसिव में कोई भी फंड नहीं है ये इंडेक्स को ट्रैक कर रहा. तो what makes this index special is something we will talk a lot about. अगले कुछ स्लाइड में कुछ नंबर्स होंगे, कुछ परफॉर्मेंस की डिटेल्स होंगी, which kind of makes this index and then naturally this fund based on this index special. तो ये क्या एलिमेंट्स हैं? लेट्स गेट स्टार्टेड. तो फर्स्टली जब हम एलिजिबल यूनिवर्स की बात करते हैं, मतलब आप स्टॉक्स कैसे चूज करेंगे, तो स्टॉक्स कैन कम फ्रॉम ऑल बीएसई ऑल कैप यूनिवर्स, विच मींस आपका लार्ज कैप, मिड कैप एंड स्मॉल कैप का यूनिवर्स आप सेट कर देते हैं. एटलीस्ट 6 महीने की लिस्टिंग हिस्ट्री होनी चाहिए, मतलब इमीडिएटली स्टॉक जैसे ही लिस्ट हुआ आप इंक्लूड नहीं कर सकते. स्टॉक शुड बी स्टेबल, स्टॉक शुड बी लिस्टेड फॉर एटलीस्ट 6 मंथ. अगर नेक्स्ट क्राइटेरिया की बात करते हैं तो ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट और एक बहुत ही न्यूआंस्ड या एक बहुत ही पेचीदा नहीं कहूंगा मैं, बट बहुत ही स्पेशलाइज्ड काइंड ऑफ क्राइटेरिया है अगर आप इसके बारे में सोचें. तो ये कहता है कि यू कैन सेलेक्ट स्टॉक्स फ्रॉम 5 एलिजिबल क्लस्टर्स. For the ease of interpretation, clusters are like your big sectors. तो क्या 5 ये sectors हैं जो enabled हैं? That is your utilities, which is mostly your power utilities. दूसरा being your energy, which is effectively energy generation focused. तीसरा being construction and engineering. चौथा is your transportation, and lastly fifth one being your NBFCs, but NBFCs catering only towards infrastructure projects. So effectively, the selection universe of this index is very refined. अगर आप आज के दिन एक एवरेज इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का एग्जिस्टिंग एक्टिव फंड देखते हैं या एनएससी का जो दूसरा इंडेक्स है एनएससी इंफ्रा इंडेक्स, हम बीएससी की बात कर रहे हैं अभी, बट अगर आप एनएससी इंफ्रा देखते हैं या एक्टिव फंड देखते हैं तो टिपिकली क्या डिफरेंसेस आते हैं. सो यू विल सी कि रिलायंस इज अगेन a fairly common name across the theme, but Reliance is typically in your refinery business. It is not really a utilities company and it is not really a energy generation company. It is predominantly a petrochemicals refinery. So वो जैसे इस इंडेक्स में नहीं enabled होता है. Again, a common name that you see across the board almost is Bharti Airtel. Bharti Airtel, because they are in the business of building towers and owning the infrastructure of, let's say, the hardware behind, let's say, the signals and telecom today, they own infrastructure, but again, they're not really in the business of infrastructure. Again, a fairly common name in most of this non-BSC universe are names like your Apollo hospitals, which again own the hospital, but again are in the business of providing healthcare versus owning infrastructure. So some of these differentiations of this index allow for a more sharper focus on kind of benefiting from outright infrastructure growth and the profitability of kind of doing that line of business versus ancillary या related line of business जो infrastructure पे dependent है. So by having that focus is what enables this performance, and we'll come to performance, and that's when आप realize करेंगे कि काफी अच्छे से ये index perform कर रहा है. And then you'll see the names also in the next slide and get a feel for कि क्या नाम है जो ये drive कर रहे हैं. In terms of stock selection, basic criteria around market cap, liquidity, and turnover to kind of ensure what comes into the index is somewhat relevant and liquid. When you look at the last set, which is effectively your constituent weighting, this is where most of the magic again lies. कि ये एक classic passive fund नहीं है. By saying that, I mean कि very much it is a passive fund, it is an index-based fund, but जब हम index की बात करते हैं, तो most commonly we think of something like Nifty 50, which is outright market cap weighted. But here you have market cap weighting, yes, but a stock level cap of 10%, 10% की stock level की cap apply करी जाती है. And ये जो 5 clusters या sectors की हमने बात करी थी, ये 30% पे एक sector या cluster cap है. So what this enables is कि आपको अच्छी diversification मिलती है across capitalization, and across names, across clusters, which enables for reasonably healthy performance in the long run by kind of taking a more broad-based exposure than just outright focusing on the top biggest names. You enable for the growth story to breathe a little bit better. So when you look at the top names today, आपके कुछ नाम तो आप लोग मोस्टली जानते होंगे. एल हो गया आपका, एनटीपीसी हो गया, पावर ग्रिड, ओएनजीसी, अदानी पोर्ट्स, इंटरग्लोब विच इज नथिंग बट योर इंडिगो, आपका आरवीएनएल, पीएफआरसी. सो सम ऑफ दीज आर द नेम्स जो आप फेमिलियर होंगे. सो आई जस्ट रिलेट सम ऑफ दीज नेम्स आउट टू यू. बट अक्रॉस द बोर्ड, stocks, as we said, were capped at 10%. The PE of the index is lower than even Nifty 50, which is your large cap, classic large cap index. वहां का PE आज के दिन 21-22 चल रहा है, depending on when you're looking at that valuation. तो आपका average PE multiple इस theme का 18 करीब है, which is fairly low. When you look at what you are getting in that multiple, you are getting about 61% large cap and roughly about 40% mid cap and small cap kind of together. So you're getting that a tilt towards mid and small at a fairly reasonable valuation. जब हम ये क्लस्टर या सेक्टर्स की बात करते हैं, आपका लार्जेस्ट सेक्टर या क्लस्टर इज यूटिलिटीज, विच इज इफेक्टिवली योर पावर डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनीज मोर देन एनीथिंग एल्स, विच इज योर एनटीपीसी, पावर ग्रिड, टाटा पावर. जब दूसरा जो सेकंड लार्जेस्ट क्लस्टर है, इट इज योर कंस्ट्रक्शन एंड इंजीनियरिंग, जिसमें आपका आता है एल एन टी, आरवीएनएल, एनसीसी एंड सो ऑन, द लिस्ट गोज ऑन. जब हम पी की बात करते हैं, as I said, you can see some of the PE numbers on screen, but the average PE across the board that you are signing up for is about 18. जब when you are looking at this column ANR, तो हमने थोड़ा रिसर्च करा इसमें कि एनालिस्ट्स क्या बोल रहे हैं. तो जब आप ब्लूमबर्ग के ऊपर एनालिस्ट रेटिंग्स देखते हैं, तो वी हैव काइंड ऑफ फैक्टर्ड इन टू नंबर्स हियर फॉर योर रिव्यू एंड अंडरस्टैंडिंग, कि roughly 87% of the analysts are saying buy or hold, and there are 24 analysts covering NTPC, for example. माने 24 analysts cover कर रहे हैं and 87% उसमें कह रहे हैं कि आप ये स्टॉक इन लेवल्स पे बाई कर सकते हैं या आप होल्ड करते रहिए. सो ये एक नंबर है कि आपको बताता है कि क्या व्यू है स्ट्रीट पे on each of these names. And across the board, you'll see as a running average, more than 85% is your ANR suggesting ki buy and hold, and more than about 10-15 on an average, analysts kind of covering it. So there's a healthy coverage for these stocks typically, and predominantly it is very much biased towards buy or hold at current levels, which means that it is a good scheme to invest in at these levels. जब हम इंडेक्स परफॉर्मेंस की बात करते हैं, आई वाज स्पीकिंग अबाउट परफॉर्मेंस अ व्हाइल बैक एंड सेइंग कि बीएससी की परफॉर्मेंस काफी अच्छी है, अब हम देखेंगे एक मिनट में. तो जब हम पीरियड्स की बात करते हैं, जैसे देखिए ये एक पीरियड है अप स्विंग टू अ डिग्री. So the green line starts fairly at the bottom or starts at the same place and then rises to the top quickly. And again, in a period of underperformance, you see that same challenge there. Then again, a period of reasonably healthy performance, again, it climbs all this way back to the top. यहाँ एक थोड़ा प्रॉब्लम हुआ कि इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर एज अ थीम हैज एक्सपोजर टू एयरलाइंस and your jet kind of collapsed here. So both your yellow line, which is your Nifty infrastructure, and your green line, which is BSE infrastructure, show that pain point of jet collapse in this period. Versus your broad-based benchmarks like Nifty 50, or for that matter, your BSE 500, where the weight of jet is nominal or to a degree it's not there. So that jet episode is there here. So this was your pandemic, COVID-19, जिसको हम commonly बोलते हैं. And then to a degree, here onwards, we've had good returns in equity markets. So as you can see, this index, whenever there are protracted periods of good returns of 10, 15, 20% compounding returns, this index does remarkably well. Naturally, October was a difficult month. So this data is as of October 22nd, which is more or less where the markets are again now. So you can see if the market has a downward correction, the index also naturally has that downward correction. When you look at this index return, it is 71% in the last year when compared to the BSE 500, which is about less than a half of this. So in period of good returns is when this index really does even better. जब हम हिस्टोरिकल परफॉर्मेंस की बात करते हैं, सो दिस इज पॉइंट टू पॉइंट रिटर्न्स P2P, और ये रोलिंग है. as in this is for specific dates and this is for periods and rolling basis. Again, you'll see the green line outperforming almost all the other comparisons, whether you're comparing BSE Infra to Nifty or NSE Infra or to Nifty 50 or to BSE 500, it does well. So what this graph is effectively telling you, जो ये आपको बोल रहा है, वो ये कह रहा है कि हर इंडेक्स सेम नहीं है, हर इंफ्रा इंडेक्स भी सेम नहीं है. सो बाय सेलेक्टिंग ये जो 5 सेक्टर या क्लस्टर जो सेलेक्ट करे हैं फेयरली सेंसिबली, और जो आपका कैपिंग दी गई है, और जो ओवरऑल सिलेक्शन लॉजिक है, मेथोडोलॉजी है, वो works very well in the long run as well as it does in the short run. So you also see 10-year returns here at about 17% rolling, or about P2P of 16. So again, across the board, you see this fairly good returns on BSE Infra. Naturally, it gives a fairly healthy Sharp of about 0.58, which is higher than the broad-based benchmarks typically. जब हम कुछ नाम की बात करते हैं या कुछ रीसेंट परफॉर्मेंस की बात करते हैं, तो मैं पिछले 2 साल के बारे में बात करना चाहूंगा. इन द लास्ट 2 years वी हैव हैड 4 रिबैलेंस. सेमी एनुअल रिबैलेंस होता है आपका इंडेक्स, मार्च में होता है एंड सितंबर में होता है. सो पिछले साल, एज इन 22-23, एज इन 2 साल बैक, सॉरी, for the September 22 to September 23 period, you can see that the index didn't perform well up till March. There was net negative return. एंड ये जो कैपिंग का जो बेनिफिट है, ये जो 10% स्टॉक लेवल और 30% क्लस्टर लेवल की बात की थी, इट नेट बेनिफिटेड द इंडेक्स बाय अबाउट 2%. फिर एक पीरियड आया ऑफ वेरी गुड रिटर्न्स, व्हिच इज दिस पीरियड इफेक्टिवली, जब द बेंचमार्क हैड अ रिटर्न ऑफ अबाउट, इन इट्स करंट शेप और फॉर्म, अ रिटर्न ऑफ अबाउट 34%, और कैपिंग नहीं होती तो सिर्फ 30% करीब होता, तकरीबन 4% का अगेन कैपिंग से बेनिफिट मिला. ONGC, L&T and NCC kind of grounded this index in this period of underperformance by kind of providing a stable base. But in a period of outperformance, naturally your L&T, NTPC and some of your smaller cap names like RVNL really contributed a lot. And again, ये जो capping logic is what allows for all of these names to have a more kind of comparable weight versus L&T dominating. So by minimizing to a degree some of these mega cap names, it allows for more breathability across the board, is what I was saying. Again, पिछला साल was remarkably good. Net 70% plus is what the returns were like. अगेन जब 40+% रिटर्न भी आते हैं तो भी आपको कैपिंग का बेनिफिट होता है. इन अ मोर स्टेबल पीरियड जब तकरीबन 20% रिटर्न आ रहे हैं तब भी कैपिंग का बेनिफिट है. सो अगेन द सिलेक्शन लॉजिक ऑफ क्लस्टर्स और सेक्टर्स एंड द कैपिंग इज मीनिंगफुली हेल्पिंग द इंडेक्स अक्रॉस ईच पीरियड. योर टॉप कंट्रीब्यूटर नेम्स हैव चेंज. आपका ओएनजीसी आ गया, एनटीपीसी आ गया जो आपके पीएसयूज हो गए, फिर अदानी पोर्ट्स आ जाता है. इस पीरियड में आपका आरवीएनएल, एनटीपीसी रिमेन्स, पावर ग्रिड आ जाता है. तो ये टॉप परफॉर्मर्स आर चेंजिंग, but the diversification magic is almost always coming to the advantage of the fund and giving healthy returns. So why select infrastructure? अभी क्यों करना चाहिए और ये क्यों ग्रो करेगा? सो मैं एक स्टार्ट आपके साथ शेयर करना चाहूंगा कि हम लोग एज एन इकोनॉमी, एज अ कंट्री, तकरीबन 14% ऑफ आवर जीडीपी, 14% ऑफ आवर जीडीपी स्पेंड करते हैं ऑन लॉजिस्टिकल कॉस्ट. माने सामान को पॉइंट ए से पॉइंट बी ले जाने के लिए, वेदर इट इज रॉ मटेरियल्स और फिनिश्ड गुड्स, एज एन इकोनॉमी 14% of our cost of the overall productivity of economy goes towards infrastructure costs. And when you compare it to some of the larger economies or some of the more manufacturing economies out there who are our peers today, this number is only about 8%. So हम 14% इस फ्रिक्शन कॉस्ट में सामान को सिर्फ मूव करने की लूज कर रहे हैं. बाकी कंट्रीज में जहां हमारे कंपैरिजन की आज के दिन इकोनॉमीज हैं या जो कंपैरिजन ऑफ एस्पिरेशन है, वहां 8% हो रहा है. तो हम 6% एक्स्ट्रा एक फ्रिक्शन की तरह लूज कर रहे हैं, जो कम करना बहुत जरूरी है टू मेक श्योर कि जो भी इंडिया में आज के दिन प्रोड्यूस हो रहा है, इट हैज अ कॉम्पिटिटिव कॉस्ट एडवांटेज. सो द गवर्नमेंट प्लान्स टू इंक्रीज केपेक्स. इस साल 11.11 लाख करोड़ का केपेक्स एलोकेटेड है, which is expected to grow at a rate of 15% here on, to reduce the logistical costs of the overall country and to ensure competitiveness in our manufacturing. अभी के वैल्यूएशंस की भी हम बात करते हैं, तो ये पूरी थीम का ट्रेलिंग पीई आज के दिन आपका 18 बनता है. Like I mentioned before, some of your large cap focused indices are also broad based ones are in 21, 22 kind of range. So you're getting reasonable valuation. जैसे हमने एनालिस्ट कवरेज की बात करी, इट इज वेरी पॉजिटिव ऑलमोस्ट अक्रॉस द बोर्ड. There's rising EPS, rising profitability forecasts across the sector. When you look at the policy framework, government policy framework and project framework is very supportive. Some of the most transformational policies and projects are kind of underway, and they are not just ending now, they're expected to continue to a degree beyond Modi's current tenure. जब हम एफडीआई की बात करते हैं, एफडीआई इज राइजिंग मोर देन 40% ऑफ द एफडीआई ऑफ द लास्ट 24 ईयर. पिछले 24 साल में से 40% से ज्यादा सिर्फ पिछले 4 साल में आया है. And as I said, some of the power sector, or to bring that green energy transition in power sector, there are some tranches where 100% FDI is also allowed. अगर हम इस फंड की बात करें, सो व्हाई दिस बीएससी इंफ्रा फंड और व्हाई दिस बीएससी इंडिया इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इंडेक्स फंड, देन दिस इज द फर्स्ट फंड टू ट्रैक दिस इंडेक्स ever launched in passive. When you look at active funds who are benchmarked to this benchmark or this index, you will see underperformance. Some of the active schemes are also benchmarked to the NSC infrastructure fund. बट अगर आप उनकी परफॉर्मेंस को भी इस इंडेक्स की परफॉर्मेंस से कंपेयर करेंगे तो आपको दिखेगा कि ये इंडेक्स इज डूइंग बेटर. So it is doing better because of this index composition logic, which does this capping and controls weight, thereby allowing breathability or heavier weights into your momentum names. When you look at by design, by how it selects clusters and, for example, excludes some of the जो kind of beneficial clusters हैं but core नहीं है to infra, by that logic also it kind of does its selection well and is continue to poise for growth from here on. तो आगे की भी pipeline kind of healthy है इधर से. कौन ले सकता है? जो लोग आज के दिन ऑलरेडी इंफ्रा में एक्सपोजर ले रहे हैं थ्रू एक्टिव स्कीम्स, दे कैन कंसिडर इट. As I said, the index fund is a superior in terms of returns in the last few years and a healthy profitability forecast here on with a reasonable valuation. जो लोग एसोसिएटेड सेक्टर्स में है और डाइवर्सिफाई करना चाह रहे हैं, जैसे कोई पावर और एनर्जी में है, कोई आपका ट्रांसपोर्ट में है, कोई आपका एनबीएफसी में एक्सपोजर है, जो ब्रॉड बेस्ड इंफ्रा की स्टोरी में जाना चाह रहे हैं in a period of sector rotation, they can kind of come into a theme which naturally enables sector rotation by taking 5 different sectors or clusters and kind of capping them. Any new investors who are looking to take a broad-based theme through an index-based or through a passive fund, and ideally for the long-term horizon, because this sector very naturally is reliant on the fact that government capex will remain positive, India's GDP will growth, because all of this is the main headwind for making sure that we keep investing in this backbone, which is India's infrastructure. So this is the overall story behind infrastructure today. And यहाँ से fairly simple है. There's an annex that we can skip in the interest of time. I was very keen to finish in 30 minutes, but थोड़ा उससे ऊपर चला गया है, so I will stop here and I will open the floor up to questions.
Okay, thanks, Deepak. The one of the questions from Mr. Rajesh Srivastav is how many total stocks are there in this index? You must have touched upon it, but can you please just revisit it?
Yeah. So total 30 stocks select किए जाते हैं. Top 30 from across those 5 clusters by market cap and reasonable liquidity scoring. Roughly, if you look at the top 15, they contribute to over 80% of the weight. So वो 15 की details deck में है, हम deck भी आपके साथ share कर देंगे, but in principle it is 30 stocks.
Okay. Another question we have is, isn't this fund a mix of Nifty, Infra and Manufacturing? From Mr. Jayant Karani.
Hanji sir, it is a mix of, no, it is not a mix of Nifty Infra. जैसा मैं बता रहा था, Nifty Infra में I can give some easy examples. वहाँ आपका Reliance is the biggest weight. No Reliance here because it is seen as a petrochemical refinery firm more than contributing to infra, no Bharti Airtel, because again, it's a telecom company and not an infra, no Apollo Hospital. So I'm just giving some of the bigger examples that you can kind of associate with. And it is, again, yes, there is a little bit of pivot towards manufacturing in construction and engineering and even in transport. But again, it is manufacturing focused on infra. So it is a focused infrastructure creation index. कि companies which are in the business of making infrastructure and profiting from infrastructure projects outright versus the more ब्रॉड बेस की हाँ इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रेजेंस है एंड मैन्युफैक्चरिंग पे फोकस कर रहे हैं. आप दोनों को साथ में ले आएंगे देन इट इज अ बेटर वे टू विजुअलाइज दिस वर्सेस सीइंग दिस एज एन एडिशन ऑफ दोस बोथ.
There are a couple of questions which are there on the expense ratios and the brokerages. Parneet ji, expense ratio as per SEBI guidelines is the same for all index passive funds, which is around 1.05, Deepak, if I'm not wrong.
हाँ जी मैम, वो जीएसटी वगैरह का थोड़ा बहुत मिलके उससे एक दो पैसे हिलता है, बट आप मोटा मोटा 1 + 0.5 + 2-4 पैसे समझिए.
Yes, so the two questions on the expense ratio. So the expense ratio is 1.05 approximately. For any questions on brokerages, please reach out to your relationship managers. They will be able to help you. One very interesting question that I would want to take in is actually that this theme is such that it is attracting a lot of interest, and even IPOs and all and active funds are benefiting. So why a passive fund, Deepak?
तो जैसा मैंने पहले कहा, आज के दिन टू पुट पुट सम स्टैट्स इन योर एट द बैक ऑफ योर माइंड एंड आप लोग इंडिपेंडेंटली चेक करिए, एंड दैट्स द बेस्ट वे टू डू दिस. आज के दिन 17 स्कीम है, 17 जो एक्टिव में एग्जिस्ट करती हैं. 1-3-5 ईयर होराइजन में दिस इंडेक्स इज आउट परफॉर्मिंग ऑल ऑफ दो स्कीम्स. So as I said, the uniqueness of this index with these 5 clusters setup than a classic passive setup. By making that investment thesis linear, by deploying this methodology, you are getting an index fund which is outperforming the active peers hands down, which is outperforming the Nifty infra hands down, which is outperforming the BSE 500 hands down. So to a degree, that is what makes it unique. We spent a lot of time in terms of understanding कि ये कैसे ग्रोथ अचीव की गई है, एंड एज आई सेड कि जो इंसाइसिव डिसीजन है इन टर्म्स ऑफ डिफाइनिंग क्या क्लस्टर्स होंगे, दैट इज व्हाट मेक्स दिस इंडेक्स यूनिक एंड काइंड ऑफ इंश्योर्स की healthy profitability remains here on. I see a couple of questions around earning season, FII outflows, high PE. So I'll recap it. In October, yes, we have seen the one of the largest and most, and to a degree, it's continued into last week, and by the looks of it, even today, one of the most protracted period of FII outflows from the Indian economy. This doesn't fundamentally change what the Indian economy promised to its investors. Yes, it has repriced some of the stocks a little bit. Yes, it has kind of taken away the shine from the recent returns, but to a degree, it has not fundamentally changed the fact that infrastructure is one of, if not the most important, then one of the key pillars of enabling manufacturing. It is also a key pillar of driving domestic consumption. At the end of the day, as we need roads, we need highways, we need trains, we need planes, we like the whole theme, we need building. Like the whole theme to a degree is very much of a growing economy. And the Indian growth story, independent of, let's say, our government, including IMF here in particular, has been highlighting the fact that India will be the strongest growing economy, at least in the large, already, in the top 10 economies for the decade ahead. So that is what is the kind of crux behind it. And October, if anything, gives a good entry point to somebody who's looking to move between existing investments or start fresh investments, versus looking at this as a long-term extended downturn. Because the GDP of our country is not affected by the price of our stock market, and infra, the theme is best compared to GDP, because when the budgets are allocated, when the capex is allocated, it is all compared to the GDP. So the Indian GDP story is not changing. In terms of PE, as I mentioned, 18 का PE है sir as an average across this index. किसी भी और index या active fund से compare कर लेंगे तो is one of the lowest PEs. It's achieved by having this mix of five clusters, जिसमें energy in particular brings you a fairly uh, lower PE kind of a mix into the index with still reasonable profitability.
One thing that I would like to add on, Deepak, before you go forward, and there are some questions, like you very rightly said, on market volatility and all. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a equity fund. All right. Equity is a long-term game. Looking at current volatility, I would actually say that it is a very good time for us to look at entering and buying on dips, because the long-term story of the country remains intact. Yes, there are some blips which have come on the earnings downgrades and the earning potentials which are being exhibited in quarter two. However, there can be a better movement in quarter three, considering a lot of factors, including an increase in rural consumption and increase in festive sales, even in the urban locations. However, having said all that, uh, I personally believe that equity remains a long term story. The fundamentals of the country remain strong in the long term, and we should look at all equity investing as a long term game, not a short term money making window, because that is never the way equity is supposed to be looked at. So in the long term, we still look at this being the decade for the country, in terms of the country doing very well on its fundamentals, and in terms of whatever the country promises to deliver, not only to its citizens but also across the world. So equity is a good bet, and I would still say that it is a good way to make wealth. Yeah, back to you, Deepak.
Thank you, ma'am, for adding up. So yeah, the investment horizon has to be considered. For a theme like infra, as I said, ये GDP का multiple है, और जब GDP की बात होती है, so it is not something you even begin discussing unless you say GDP and link it with years. So ये वो year on year वाली growth story है. This is not a month on month growth story. किसी ने पूछा है कि स्मॉल कैप एंड मिड कैप में तकरीबन 40% एक्सपोजर है. इज इट अ गुड टाइम टू टेक एक्सपोजर एट दिस लेवल? तो सर ये आउटराइट स्मॉल कैप एंड मिड कैप प्ले नहीं है. while there is small cap and mid cap by design to a degree which gets enabled, but to a degree it is top 30 stocks across these five clusters. So the small cap and mid cap which get enabled get breathing weight by waiting getting controlled, versus your smaller or riskier small cap and mid cap where visibility of earnings is lesser, kind of making it. So you get your more quality small cap and mid cap names because they're still selected from the top, and then they're given a little bit more by capping your large cap. So it's not like 40% is small cap and mid cap, and some of the more smaller or the more less liquid, or let's say the more volatile names kind of naturally make their way in. So same way when you look at the Sharpe ratio of the index, it is better than Nifty 50, it is better than Nifty Infra for that matter. It kind of speaks about the quality of the small cap and mid cap that naturally gets included. Somebody says, can you compare it with a consumption fund? So, sir, a consumption fund is very clearly focused today. To a degree, consumption fund में largest sector is FMCGs. Airlines can, yes, be in a consumption fund, but your largest sector is FMCG. Some consumption funds even include some realty. So हाँ, थोड़ा बहुत कुछ आपका overlap हो सकता है. ऐसा नहीं है कि ये tangentially opposite themes हैं. But the infra theme is more closely focused on and expansionary on an expansionary GDP versus a flatlining GDP, for example, like Japan, where domestic consumption is fairly healthy, but a GDP is kind of flatlining. So between the two countries, the example I'm trying to bring in is that as your GDP is growing, infrastructure compounds on that a little better than to a degree a consumption fund will or aims to. Naturally, yes, the flexibility of a consumption fund as a theme also allows it to kind of go and select the stocks across all themes which can be considered linked to consumption. So overlaps are there. And yes, the Indian consumption growth story is also fairly healthy. So it's not a one versus the other, but it is more of a which of them is probably more broad based, and probably infra is even more broad based than classically consumption. After BSc infra at the same time NSC infra didn't. Hanji, so
What is the logic that the BSE infra has double the return of the compared to NSE?
Hanji sir. So some of the thing as I was saying goes into the stock. So as I mentioned, some of the key stocks which are different are Reliance, जो आपका at the end of the day एक petrochemicals refinery company है which operates on margins versus outright developing or finding new sources of let's say oil. So the profitability in that company is more linear. Again, telecom when you take in Bharti Airtel naturally has more linear profitability than somebody like RVNL who might win a new contract, or L&T who might win a new massive contract and employ more people to then develop or deliver that contract. So when you look at again something like Apollo, which I had mentioned earlier, again it's a more linear. So NSC infra is a more let's say broad-based view on infra. So the way NSE selects companies is they select 40 industries. So sectors or clusters are a higher level, but they select at a lower level, but 40 industry level. But these industries to a degree map into more than five clusters from BSE perspective. And by having this more broad-based scheme, NSE Infra is more like your, let's say, a even more broad-based index, which doesn't then get the multiplicative effect of the government spending or infrastructure capex, or for that matter, project expansion that BSC does. Because they include companies which are in the business of spending on infra but not profitably, or kind of profitability is not married to the infra, it's married to the other core line of business. तो वहां पे डिफरेंस शुरू होता है. And then this 10% and 30% cap at stock and cluster level. Naturally, your NSC infra fund ends up having Reliance at almost 20, L&T at almost 20%. So by having that, the rest of the constituents get kind of, squished out a little bit. But by kind of, having this differentiated setup of both stock and cluster level cap, it creates this difference. And that is why when you see the deck, and we'll share the deck with you, there are two slides which are speaking specifically about the impact of stock and cluster level weighting, and वो डाउन साइकिल अप साइकिल दोनों में प्रोजेक्ट कर रहा है कि पिछले 2 सालों में 4 रीबैलेंसेस में कितना मीनिंगफुली इम्पैक्ट हुआ है. And effectively, you're getting about साल का 8% return through this weighting logic also, which NSE is not deploying in the same way. So those are the building blocks which are making this a unique index.
Some questions on what is your take on PSU, because there are some PSU stocks in this index.
So in terms of, I think there's a question also kind of which is related to energy and power sector. So yes, the
Yes.
index does take exposure to PSUs, and naturally a lot of those PSUs are focused on energy and power sector. When you look at the fund manager commentary across most active funds, and I was speaking to somebody during an interview earlier today, power and energy is one of the most favorably looked upon sectors today. The month-on-month deficit of power in India is only growing. And as I said, both individual consumption, corporate consumption, the rising use of air conditioning, the weather patterns, whatever you call it, is driving it forward. So, yes, PSUs have benefited in the last few years from a repricing mix. But by taking them in a broad-based theme like infra, you are balancing the risk further. That they might not do well in the next month, in the next 2 months, in the next 6 months. But given the demand of power today, given the profitability of the overall sector, when you look at it from a long-term perspective, you are getting ample exposure in this theme. In the meantime, to kind of enable the growth, you also are getting exposure to about 3 or 4 other clusters that can help that transition and kind of take it forward. So you don't necessarily have to worry about sector rotation. By doing this 30% sector or cluster level cap, the index is doing all of this for you and kind of enabling that investment journey. How much of infra? So roughly, as I said, 3.4% of your nominal GDP or 5.3, 5.4% of your real GDP. The difference between these two GDP numbers is inflation adjustment. Last, I think the inflation adjustment had happened in 2021, but effectively that is the GDP. Contribution to GDP, sir, it's hard to say. As I said, roughly 14% of the country's GDP today is spent on logistical costs as an economy. For every rupee that the government does invest in infra, typical expectation is 3x GDP multiplier. But as a sector, how this contributes to GDP is probably in those two answers, to put it honestly. Best option to make one time or STP. I think, sir, given how broad-based it is very amply suited to a one-time as well. Then you can follow it up. But it is not an overpriced sector. I think I've mentioned this a few times. The 18 के forward, sorry, trailing PE पे trade कर रहा है. You will struggle to find a cheaper sector to switch into. Can we call this as mid cap and small cap? Not really, Nishchal, because the mid cap, the focus is to have large cap. The focus is to enable companies doing the core infra business. It so happens that the mid cap and small cap companies also are doing some core infra business. And wherever that is the case, they are given a healthy participation. So yes, it is a more mid and small oriented than a typical infrastructure fund. But it is not a mid and small focused infra fund, because that will end up being a lot more volatile. So it is mixing that volatility with returns. L&T, despite being one of the major names in the last 3 years, has more than doubled. So yes, you do want some exposure, but you naturally don't want to get married only to that. So it's kind of balancing those two elements together. Uh, Theme has peaked out now. No, this theme hasn't particularly peaked out. As I said, अगर आप peak out की बात करेंगे, तो you can say the overall equity markets have peaked out more across the multiples, in fact. So yes, this theme has done well, but yeah, it isn't peaked out in the same way as typically you say peaked out, because when you look at the multiples, they are a lot more rationalized. Yes, this is a theme that is probably better suited, as ma'am also mentioned, to long term, because this is more married into GDP than most other themes, and GDP is a year-on-year story, not a month-on-month story. But this is a reasonable time as any to kind of consider kind of getting started in this in a fairly meaningful way with the October's correction now behind us. Why should yes? काफी बड़ा सवाल आया राहुल से, मैं पढ़ रहा
हाँ जी.
हूँ. If we are happy with the nifty returns, why we should take this aggressive call in infra? Yes, infra, but we can expect entry and timely exit from your side. Secondly, many companies are increasing their percentage of holdings in large cap, considering what is okay.
Basically, Mr. Jain, one thing is that this is an index fund, so it will be mapped to the index and it will perform as per the index. We will not have an exit and entry happening in this fund from our side. It will be all linked to how the index performs. So that is one part of your question. The rest, I'm sure Deepak will be able to answer better than me.
Hanji, from an individual's entry and exit, if somebody is happy with Nifty to a degree, then yes, Nifty has given more than 30% return. This has given more than double of that. But its entry and exit at a constituent level is defined by the index. At an investor's perspective, if an investor is looking to expand beyond the class, again, आपका सवाल ऐसा लग रहा है कि आपके पास कोई पैसिव फंड है और निफ्टी पकड़ा हुआ है आपने. अगर आप वो पोर्टफोलियो को एक्सपैंड करना चाह रहे हैं पैसिव साइड में, then this is one of the few thematic funds which is going across 4 or 5 sectors, as we were discussing, or 4 or 5 clusters. Again, the large cap weighting of this is about 60%, and this fund is doing that 60-40 mix roughly as per its current constituents. If the large cap continues to outperform, then to a degree, by next rebalance, you will actually see a bigger weight of the large cap, because that's how the index is designed. To a degree, if more companies in large cap are doing well, their weightage allocation, while does cap at 10% stock level, overall that 60 will favor that. But historically, some of the mid cap and small cap names in this sector are benefiting from the are benefiting from the capex projects that they are kind of winning and the order profitability and pipeline that is there ahead of them. So by having this mix, it's balancing those two aspects without creating churn at a individual holder level and then attracting tax to a degree. By manifesting itself across 5 clusters and having those caps, it does that reallocation basis performance naturally on a 6 monthly rebalance basis. From a percentage of allocation perspective, this is not it is naturally an equity theme with going across market caps, but it is not a volatile or a very highly priced themes as things stand. So for whoever is looking to take benefit from some government capex or some government policy linked broad-based cluster, they can allocate. They can, like, depends on the investor appetite almost entirely. But something like a 20-30% allocation to a broad-based cluster like this is fairly reasonable. It's not unheard of. Is there any concentration risk? Hanji sir, there is always a concentration risk in any passive fund. But as I mentioned a few times, one of the best parts and one of the reasons why we are launching this index and why we are excited about it is that it does this stock level at 10% and kind of reduces that concentration risk. आज के दिन अगर आप निफ्टी को भी देखते हो तो आपके टॉप 10 names are more than 65%. So concentration risk is part of the game, but it is doing quite a few things intelligently to minimize that concentration risk.
I think that should be all in terms of questions, Deepak. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. If there are no more questions, we are already over time. So let us call. Thank you all for. Acha, yes, Mr. Deepak Yadav, please go ahead.
किसी ने एक सवाल पूछा, थोड़ा पर्सनल लगा तो मैं आंसर कर देता हूँ. Anonymous attendee has asked defense fund के ऊपर. हाँ जी सर, so from when we launched to as things stand, आपका broader market has corrected by, depending on again what you use as your metric for broader market, from 6 to 9% as things stand this morning. The defense fund from when we launched to now has corrected by less than that, despite being one of the more momentum oriented, one of the more volatile themes from when we launched. And I think I spoke about this at the time of our launch and multiple times as well, that we launched well after the budget. We launched at a time where things were settled in period versus running off. So from our launch till date, with the market correction, in fact, you realize the resilience of that sector. BEL earnings were strong, Mazgaon earnings were strong. Some of the names have corrected materially. But as an index, from launch till date, it is showing more resilience than your broader market. So yes, it has in fact in October, it hasn't corrected downwards. It had corrected pre-October. It had corrected when we had launched. It was nearly September, so it corrected more in September, and coming into October, in fact, it has held stable. Which is to say the fact that yes, it is slightly different than the broader equity market. It is still probably one of the more momentum rich, but given the good earnings this time around, it has held itself up through this correction with a lot more resilience than in fact I had anticipated. So that speaks about it. And then depending on your current allocation, you can consider probably upping it. But again, that is not a sector where you should have majority of your allocations. Unlike infra, which is a lot more broad based, defense at the end of the day is a lot more focused.
Thank you so much, Deepak. And I was anticipating you will take up this question, but anyways, all right. Thank you so much, Deepak, and thanks everyone for joining. And we would sincerely urge now you to take a look at this fund favorably. Whether you want to do it through SIP, STP, or lump sum, I will leave to you. But definitely, infrastructure is one of the biggest themes today because that is what, like we said, is the backbone for a developing country. It is mandatory for us to have the right infrastructure, to have ease of business, to have the right infrastructure to be able to grow. Hence, the theme remains, and we believe is an evergreen theme in any case. All right. So, look forward to your keen participation, and we'll be happy to answer any more questions. Please reach out to us either through your RMs or to any of us directly. Thank you so much and take care. Have a good evening.